In this next video, let's dig into the different types of transit that we might see out in our communities. This is sort of the menu of options that might be available to a transit agency. So the real workhorse of transit systems is the bus. Buses are fairly inexpensive, they can use a variety of fuels, and very importantly, they're also extremely flexible in terms of where you route them, where they stop, what their timetables are, and so they don't require an incredible amount of investment short of the vehicles themselves in order to set up or modify new routes. Because of these incredible economies associated with bus transit, it is by far the most prevalent form of mass transit. The major downside associated with most bus transit is that it shares a right-of-way with other traffic. So on the one hand, this is the benefit, right, is that we can use infrastructure that already exists, the public roadways. On the other hand, it means that buses can get stuck in traffic. It's very difficult for them in many cases to adhere to a timetable, to be reliable, and this can be very dependent on time of day or which part of town the bus has to pass through in order to get to your stop. If you're trying to catch a bus that's coming through downtown, it might be considerably held up, whereas a bus coming from an outlying area is probably facing considerably less congestion and is much more likely to be on time. Buses, particularly in the United States, also seem to have very little cachet. They're often viewed as somewhat of an inferior transit mode, particularly relative to trains. And in some sense, this might be due to the practical disadvantages that buses have in terms of avoiding traffic. On the other hand, I think there's a real problem with bus agencies, particularly in the US, not putting enough emphasis on user experience for their riders, and this translating into a pretty negative image for buses in terms of what it's like to ride them. By contrast, I like to give the example of buses in London, which is the photo up here on top. These buses are sort of iconic. They're the double-decker types that you see here. They're actually operated as a regulated monopoly that's franchised out through London's transit agency. The way the London buses are designed, both on the outside and also on the inside, clearly has a lot of thought put into it in terms of user experience. They're fairly clean, they're fairly airy with large windows and transparent surfaces, bright colors. There's just, a level of design intention here that you don't see in a lot of American buses that by contrast are fairly utilitarian. I think if American bus agencies put a little more emphasis into making these systems iconic, feel like places that there's been a lot of intention put into in terms of making them just nice places to be, that would really go a long way in terms of improving the image of bus transit and probably for fairly minimal cost relative to a lot of the other operational expenses of a transit system. One way that transit agencies have addressed some of the functional issues around buses is through this thing called bus rapid transit, which essentially blends some of the best elements of bus transportation, particularly its affordability in terms of the infrastructure investment, with some of the best aspects of rail transportation, particularly the designated right-of-way and having stations where people can wait for the next vehicle to come and also really efficiently board vehicles when they do come. So this example is the Transmilenio system, which is in Bogota, Colombia, and has become one of the iconic examples of bus rapid transit in South America. You can see that there is a separated lane away from the congested traffic over here, so the buses are free-flowing. You can see there's a station where people can wait. You prepay for the bus so that it's very quick to board right at the level of the floor of the bus, just like with a subway. And then the buses, very much like some of the best subway systems, come with very low headways, very short time intervals between the buses, and they travel very quickly between the stations. So in essence, it functions like rail transit without nearly the expense of building a subway system. So now let's turn our attention to transit by rail and start with what we call light rail. The light here refers to the weight of the trains and also informs the speed at which they can travel. So light rail tends to be fairly slow relative to things like subway systems, which we'll talk about in a second, which are considered heavy rail. Light rail systems generally run on electric power. They can have either shared rights of way or exclusive rights of way. So, for example, the Muni system in San Francisco is a light rail system. It runs underground with an exclusive right of way downtown. And then toward the end of the lines, for example, out on the N Judah, it runs above ground and it runs in the street. So it is affected by traffic congestion and speeds, and certainly suffers some substantial delays due to traffic congestion in those places. One of the main critiques of light rail is that it is substantially more expensive than a bus system, but doesn't necessarily provide all that much more in the way of service in terms of, how many people it can carry, how quickly, and it certainly is more limiting than bus in that it's not as flexible. You can't just move the tracks of a light rail system once you put them down. However, that also leads us to one of the reasons that light rail has become so popular in recent years, is that it is such a heavy investment in a place that it becomes an anchor for development. So in a lot of cases, light rail systems are installed in downtown areas. A good example is the VTA system in San Jose. And these are used as ways of catalyzing growth in a downtown region. Because light rail doesn't go all that fast, in many cases its range is not very large, and so it's probably just for travel sort of around a downtown area. But because there is all this upfront investment that goes into laying rails and making stations, it does do a good job of signaling that land around these transit corridors will be fairly high accessibility due to the light rail system for a long period of time. And so light rail systems have almost become these icons for cities, whereas bus services may have very low cachet, light rail systems have somewhat high cachet, even if you don't get all that much bang for your buck on a functional level. And then the next step up with rail systems is what we call heavy rail. Heavy rail is a fairly large umbrella for different types of systems, but all of which have rolling stock that are heavier and move considerably faster than light rail systems. So subway or mass rapid transit systems fall into the category of heavy rail. Here we can see the BART example. Within subways, there are systems that are designed more for regional movement, and BART would fall into that category. Its stations are fairly spread out, sometimes miles apart from one another, and so it's much better for commuting from suburbs and into city centers than it is really for moving around inside of the urban core. You could contrast that with a subway system like the one in New York, or maybe the L in Chicago, which has much denser stops within the urban core and is really useful for very local travel. Commuter rail like Caltrain also fits under the umbrella of heavy rail, as do systems like Amtrak that are designed mostly for moving between cities, intercity, as opposed to within cities. Essentially, all subway systems run on electricity, and that's usually provided by a third rail down next to the wheels. Other heavy rail, like commuter and intercity rail systems, in the US tend to be primarily run on diesel fuel. However, trains within the Northeast Corridor between Boston and Washington, D.C. in the U.S. are mostly operated electrically. Caltrain is in the late stages of an electrification program, but the vast majority of other U.S. heavy rail is still diesel-powered. In many other countries, heavy rail is predominantly electrically powered, at least for passenger trains. There are also a variety of what I might call fringe modes, usually that are helping transit systems deal with geographic obstacles. So, for example, many cities are built around water bodies. The Bay Area is no exception, and ferries have played an important role historically in connecting across those water bodies. In the Bay Area, we still have a fairly robust system of these high-speed ferries that take people to different points across the bay. One nice thing about ferries, similar to buses, is that they're incredibly flexible. If you want to change the route, you just need to build a new dock, and then you can, send the ferry to a different point along that same water body. There are also a variety of different technologies developed for dealing with really hilly areas. This example from Paris is something called a funicular, which is essentially a railway that's designed to go up a very steep incline. You can see that the car is actually built on a chassis that's angled so that the floor remains level even as it's going up this hill. And then this example from La Paz, Bolivia, where they've actually used gondolas as their primary mode of mass transit, which helps overcome obstacles like hills. It also means that they've avoided disrupting land uses on the ground while constructing their mass transit system because it essentially just goes overhead. As I've mentioned in some previous videos, paratransit is an important part of the US system for providing equitable services to folks with disabilities. But there's also been some increasing interest in the US context in privately owned paratransit services. So this company called Bridge, which was based in Boston, it's actually defunct now. They're no longer operating. But for a little while, they were experimenting with providing these very small buses that would use an app to coordinate where and when people wanted to make commutes, a little bit like the pool version of rideshare services, except they would operate slightly larger vehicles and it would be a fairly consistent service on a daily basis aimed at commuting. So while this particular company is no longer operating, I think this is the sort of thing that we'll be seeing increased interest in the private sector in the US. While I've been introducing and reflecting on these different transit modes as if they're somewhat disconnected from one another, it's important to remember that in most cities, all of these different modes play a fairly interconnected role in creating transit systems. And in the best case scenario, these transit systems are well coordinated, maybe by operators that are operating multiple different modes within the same city, maybe by MPOs that have a role in coordinating different transit operators, and even really simple things like the Clipper card in the San Francisco Bay Area, which allows people to pay for all of the different transit modes with the same form, can go a long way to making these systems more integrated with one another. Because different transit modes have different strengths and weaknesses, most cities are probably going to benefit from having, a diverse range of transit modes and then facilitating connections between them. And so a substantial role for planners is to identify where there are opportunities or constraints in using one mode or another, and how those systems can become better integrated with one another.